So I borrowed some Play-Doh this week from the Early Learning Center. I love Play-Doh. It's fun to play with. It's squishy, and you can make stuff with it. You can get one of those machines where you put the Play-Doh in it, and you push down, and it makes spaghetti. My kids love Play-Doh. When my kids have it, it strikes fear into my heart, though, because when kids have Play-Doh, it always ends up getting ground into the carpet and stuck to the dog. So, pros and cons, right? Play-Doh, I learned this week, was not made to get ground into the carpet and stuck to the dog. It wasn't made to be a kid's toy. That's not why it was invented. The reason that Play-Doh was invented, it was invented to clean marks off wallpaper. That's what the inventor thought it was going to do. They thought it was going to be something that you could use to clean. Could you imagine if they had just stuck with that? I don't think they'd be doing as well, right? I don't think the Play-Doh company would have made it if they had just stuck with that as its purpose. Somewhere along the line, the purpose of Play-Doh went from being a cleaner to something else, and that something else has turned out to be really good. We are made for a purpose, and sometimes we're not sure what the purpose is. Sometimes when we think about purpose, we begin to ask these questions that almost feel existential and big and scary, right? What am I made for? What am I here for? What do I exist for? What's my calling and role and purpose in life? Sometimes when we begin to ask those questions, they feel a little bit overwhelming. But grasping our purpose as the people that God has made us to be, grasping our purpose that we can join with God is a really important and life-giving thing. When you find the way that your purpose, the gifts, the passions, the experiences, the things that you have kind of carried with you, when you find the way that those join with what it is that God is doing in the world, it is life-giving and exhilarating, and it is one of those things that deeply connects us to God and to each other. Over the last couple of weeks, Pastor Mike and I have been talking about what it means for Suncrest to be a community of hope. We are a place of hospitality where we practice radical welcome. We are a place of offering where we offer the story of God to all, and we offer our life's story to God. And last week, Pastor Mike talked about how we begin to do that, thinking about those people in our life, those friends, relatives, associates, neighbors, coworkers, those people who need to hear this good story. And this morning, we think about what it is for us to know our God-given purpose. Have you ever seen something that has outlived its purpose? In my house, all of our media, our music, our TV, our movies, it's all streaming. And so my kids don't know what a DVD or a CD is, right? So we've got like 2 CDs in our house. They were from recordings that Beth and I did when we sang in the college choir. Those aren't streaming anywhere, so they're stuck on a shelf. And the kids found them the other day, and they brought them up to us, and they said, what does this do? Like, what is this? And I realized that those CDs had far outlived their purpose because, honestly, at this point, I don't even have a CD player. There's not even a drive on my computer for me to put it in, right? I have these CDs. All they really are good for is to be shiny. They have far outlived their purpose. When we lose our sense of purpose, we become adrift and uncertain of what we're supposed to do. We become disconnected from kind of the fundamental nature of who we are, and we're not quite sure where to turn. Jesus talks about that in Matthew's gospel that we read this morning. Jesus says, you're the salt of the earth. Salt is something that gives flavor to the world, but if you lose your saltiness, if you lose your ability to do the one thing you're supposed to do, it's not good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled on by men. Jesus says, you're the light of the world, but if you cover that light up, that light isn't able to do what it's supposed to do. It's not able to give light to the house. No one would do that on purpose. Jesus says, you have been given a task, an ability, a purpose. You have been given experiences and gifts, it's time to use those to be part of the work that God is doing in the world. The powerful thing about purpose is when we really begin to discover what we were made for, we become deeply connected to ourselves because we begin to see the ways that our gifts and experiences, our abilities, the things that we hold in our hands give us opportunity to engage with what it is that God is doing in the world. Sometimes I think all those things, gifts and experiences, abilities, passions, are like guardrails that continue to funnel us down more and more and more towards our purpose. They begin to point us towards the reason that we were made. When we can begin to become deeply in touch with those things, we realize that we were made and shaped and created in God's image. And when we realize that we were made and shaped and created in God's image, that God has breathed into us these gifts, this divine spark, that God has awoken something in us, we become more deeply connected to God. We become more aware of God's work as creator, the one who shaped us and made us and formed us. We become more aware of the ways that God is working in our lives and in the world. And when we become more aware of the ways that God is working in our lives and in the world, we realize that we get to join with God in what God is doing to right and renew and restore all things. We realize that God is inviting us to use our gifts and abilities and experiences, that divine spark that has been placed inside of us, to make sure that the world sees Jesus. Frederick Buechner, the writer and theologian, wrote this quote, and it's one of these quotes that I just love. It's one of the ones that sticks with me and reminds me of what purpose looks like. Buechner says this: "The place that God calls you is to the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. The place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." When we can find that place where our gifts, abilities, our dreams, our hopes meet with the deep hunger that the world experiences to know, love, hope, healing, compassion, justice, rightness, wholeness, holiness, when we find that sweet spot, we begin to live fully into the purpose for which God has made us. Eugene Peterson, who wrote The Message, which is a translation or a paraphrase of the Bible, writes the passage that we read this morning about salt and light like this. And I like his imagery, so let's listen to the paraphrase that Eugene Peterson puts in The Message. "Let me tell you why you are here. You are here to be salt, seasoning that brings out the God flavors of this earth. If you lose your saltiness, how will people taste godliness? You've lost your usefulness and will end up in the garbage. Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors in the world. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket, do you? I'm putting you on a light stand. Now that I've put you there on the hilltop, on a light stand, shine. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven." Peterson says that we are to be the God colors and God flavors of the world. As I read a commentary this week, he wrote that Christians are to be tasty and lit up, which maybe is a different way to put it, right? We are to be tasty and lit up. We are to be offering to the world through our purpose, through our ability, our experience, our work, who it is that God is. Purpose is a powerful thing when we can really tap into it. I've learned in the last several years, particularly in the work that I've done with folks in recovery, that when you can allow people to tap into a greater purpose for their life, there's actually a healing process that takes place in people's brains. There's a physiological healing that can occur when people find purposeful work, when they can re-embrace and embrace the purpose that they have been made for and realize that their life carries dignity and worth. Powerful healing can be done. When work is not just work for work's sake, but when work allows people to tap into the gifts, the abilities, the experiences that they have, good things happen. When we as God's people can tap into the gifts, the experiences, the abilities that God has given us, when we can demonstrate the God flavors and God colors to the world, good things happen. Now, I think purpose, as we see it lived out, can happen in a couple ways. First of all, I think there is something for us to grasp in our individual purpose, and our purpose as individual people. I watched a show on Netflix a couple years ago called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Samin Nosrat, who's a cookbook writer, a chef, a food reviewer, made this show, and she talks about salt, fat, acid, and heat as being the four components of good cooking. Cooking just has those four things, and if you balance those things correctly, the food can be good. She goes all over the world exploring these four components of good cooking. It's really a lovely show if you haven't watched it. But when she begins to talk about salt, she goes to Japan and begins to explore the Japanese culture and the flavors of salt and umami that kind of emerge from Japanese culture. She said in this show, and I checked it this week to make sure that I remembered correctly, she said in the show that there are 4,000 different kinds of salt in Japanese cuisine. 4,000 different kinds of salt. I mean, I thought there was like the Morton's that's in the blue container. And then recently I got some pink Himalayan salt, and I really thought I was moving up in the world. Like I had two, right? She says there are 4,000 different kinds of salt. Each has its own flavor and kind of saltiness and can be used in particular dishes. Some are flaky, and some are tiny and granular, and some are crumbly, and they each have a specific use and purpose that can be used to flavor food. What would it look like for us to realize that we are each a unique grain of salt? That we bring our unique experiences and abilities and giftedness to play in the world. And that God is calling us to tap deeply into the reasons for which we have been made. I just want to be clear. I think that God is calling each of us, all of us, to tap deeply into the work of discerning our purpose. I think sometimes in the church, when we talk about calling as being for pastors or clergy or people that work on a church staff, and I think that's too narrow. I think God is calling each of us into the priesthood of all believers. I think God is calling each of us to be engaged in God's work. And when we narrow calling to just a certain few, we miss out on the ability that God is giving each of us to make an impact for God's kingdom in the world, to announce the rule and reign of God, and to offer the gifts that we have to God to be used for God's good purpose. What is it that God is inviting you to offer? What are the gifts that God has given you? What are the abilities that God has placed in your hands? What are the experiences that have shaped who you are? How is God inviting you to tap deeply into purpose? Purpose is not just about knowing it, it's about living it and beginning to do it. And sometimes when we understand what it is that we've been made to do, we can begin to put those things into practice. Sometimes you may get paid for them, sometimes you may not. Purpose and vocation and work are not always all wrapped up in one another. But when we begin to offer to God each of our individual gifts and abilities, God uses those to make a difference in the world. What is it that God has given you? What is it that God is saying to you? Offer this back to me, and together we will be about the good work of bringing a new way of life. I think there's something individual to purpose, but I think more than that, there's also something corporate to purpose. There's something that happens when we all gather together as the church to be about God's work together, when we each bring our gifts and abilities and passions, when we each bring our experiences to this place and become deeply woven into Christ's body, we join with God in what God is doing through all of us. It's not about one of us, it's about all of us. Maybe you're like me. Maybe one of the kind of high points of Christmas for you is coming to Christmas Eve service. I love the end of Christmas Eve service where we turn the lights out in the sanctuary and the darkness settles in and we all pull out our candles. And as the light begins to spread through the sanctuary, we are reminded that together, when we each offer our light, there is something powerful that happens and the darkness cannot withstand it. I have a picture from this past year's Christmas Eve service where we met in a parking lot. We each held up our sparklers. It's a beautiful picture of a church that moved from outside of the building into a community where even the darkness that seemed to pound in the last year could not overcome it. You see, friends, God has given us the ability to be light to the world. God has called us to offer our light together, to illuminate the dark places, to announce the rule and reign of God, to demonstrate that God is still at work in the world. God has given us a purpose to announce and to be a place of hope. And when we offer together our light, the darkness has no chance. I do wonder, though, if sometimes we as the church have our light, but rather than let it shine, we put a basket on top of it. I do wonder whether sometimes our divisions and distrust of one another, whether our unwillingness to listen to each other, whether the nostalgia that we have for what we once were, or the fear that we have about what we might be, causes us to put a basket over the light. I do wonder whether God is inviting us to make sure that we shine well together to be light to the world. God has a purpose for each one of us as individuals, and God has a purpose for us as Suncrest United Methodist Church. There are many people who've shared with me, and I agree, that there is a reason that God put this church on this corner many, many years ago when this corner was not what it is today. When this church was started here many years ago, there weren't thousands of cars that passed by on a daily basis. God continues to call us to live out our God-given purpose, to offer healing and hope, to be about God's business, that together we can celebrate and see the work that God is doing. May we each embrace our purpose as individuals, and may we as God's church join together to be a place of healing and hope. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, thank you for the ways that you are calling us to engage with our purpose, the purpose that you've given us and the work that you've called us to. Help us as your people to be salt and light, to illuminate the God colors to the world, to offer to the world the flavor of who you are, that those who long to know the hope and healing you provide can find it. Help us to be a place and a people that offer our gifts as individuals and together, that we might join with you in the work that you're doing. We give you thanks for the ways that you're inviting us to be about this work. Continue to call us to be a place of purpose. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.